Okay, I'm excited to do this writing workshop. One of the things that has really grabbed my attention lately and fascinated me are the recent TikTok trends. So, in the month of September, it was the Devious Lick, where kids were vandalizing school property and stealing things from their teachers' classrooms and off their desk and making TikTok videos with stolen soap dispensers and stolen posters off of a teacher's wall and whatnot. And I just got to thinking, what motivates students to do that? What's the point? And ultimately, in terms of my essential question for this synthesis paper, how much is a like worth? So we had a phenomenal Socratic seminar about this essential question and tied it to things going on in September, but also October is Slap a Teacher month, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on with these TikTok trends? And then for the 2021-2022 academic year, students across the nation have laid out the focal point for all the months through June. And there's some pretty scary, harrowing things that are coming up topically in the coming months. So I thought this was a great opportunity to have a synthesis essay worked in to this pop cultural topic that all of our students are paying attention to and they're living. It's very relevant. So I like for early synthesis essays when I'm teaching my templates to start with essential questions. And this is what it is. How much is a like worth? So what we did before we wrote was had a Socratic seminar, and then prior to that, we read 5 articles that I located for them. And I can post those articles if you would like, but you could find any 5 you want. And one of the things that really intrigued me was that there were a number of articles and students that talked about how the TikTok trends are a form of protest, that basically every decade has its thing. So the 60s had their protest and their hippie hair and their music, and the 70s had disco, and the 80s had hair bands, and the 90s had their grunge and flannel, etc. And they were saying to me in the Socratic seminar, well, saying to the group that the 2020s want to be known for their TikTok trends. So years down the road, 20, 30 years from now, they'll be remembered for what they're doing. And it's kind of, in a sense, 2 middle fingers up to society saying, hey, older generations, you guys kind of screwed us over and we're inheriting a terrible world with, we're in a pandemic, our economy's terrible, you know, college is pretty much worthless to some extent. So, yeah, so that's where we're going to go with this. So I will show you my templates. We'll go from the declarative and the inverted thesis for the introductory paragraphs, and then we will tackle the body paragraph syllogistically. And I'll go through it very slow, especially if this is your first time. So here's the prompt. In light of recent TikTok trends, consider the extent to which a like is worth it. Consider why this phenomena is occurring from a social perspective. To help support and defend your position, synthesize at least 3 sources. So the students saw the prompt before the Socratic seminar, and this is what we ultimately debated. And there was a wide variety of insights and offerings during that seminar that fueled some ideas for possible theses for the paper. So, the big thing that I always emphasize with teachers that I work with is the following idea, that you got to Bob Ross your instruction. And what I mean by that is this: you have to provide plenty of exemplars and models of your own writing to your students, because if you position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom, they can learn from you. They need to see good writing, a lot of good writing, in order to grow, flourish, and mature as writers. And I always give the following analogy. Imagine if Bob Ross comes onto the screen and says, "Hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge going over a babbling brook." And then he just said, "Deuces, I'm leaving. I'll come back in a half hour and see what you do." That would be assigning. And I think a lot of English teachers are guilty of that. We assign writing instead of explicitly teaching. Bob Ross sits there at the canvas and walks us through step by step how to create that painting. And we can follow along with him, even if we are the most inept painters. We can approximate what he's doing. And then if we were to practice, painting after painting after painting, we'd become quite adept painters. And the same goes for our student writers. Even the struggling and emerging ones can learn a lot from our exemplars and models. So I always say paint with your students, and that's what I'm going to do with you in this video, is paint my way through this essay with you with my exemplars and models. So the first question that needs to be asked is, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And it's simple. I always tell my students, you declare or invert the thesis. So for all the expository modes, rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and research, you can always declare or invert the thesis. It works every single time. So it demystifies the writing process, and with time, as students practice the template, they guarantee themselves to write a thesis statement, which is half the battle. So let's break down what I mean by declarative and inverted. So we have ourselves an essential question, all right? To what extent are the likes needed? Like why are the kids so fascinated by getting likes on their TikTok videos? So you begin by answering the essential question if you declare. So out of the gate, just boom, drop your answer to the question. That's a very good way for a struggling and emerging writer to produce a thesis, is just out of the gate, drop it. And then provide context and background. Tier 2 level vocabulary, what I mean by that is just your average academic SAT level words. It's an academic paper, so we'd like to see some academic diction in there. And then sentence constructs. I teach my students how to write, how to manipulate their syntax. We study Strunk and White's Write It Right, and their example in there about how there's 12 different ways to write a single sentence, and my students are very well versed in manipulating all 12 sentence constructs. So here's the kicker though with introductions. Whether the student goes declarative or inverted, it's always 4 sentences long, no more, no less, especially while the scaffolds are up and the training wheels are on. When they're learning how to write within the confines of this template, 4 sentences. The inverted, you start with the context and background, possibly a hook or an analogy. So you got to have your tier 2 level vocabulary in there, focus on the sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, and flow, and then you end by answering the essential question. So the 4th sentence is going to be the answer to the essential question. So that's how that works. But here's the thing. The benefits of Bob Rossian instruction. I wrote 4 introductions for you and for my students, and it became readily apparent to me that it's really difficult to declare the thesis for this essential question. So all of mine ostensibly invert. I just really couldn't do the declarative. So that's very important for our students to know, that the expert teacher by default every single time went the inverted route. So that further demystifies the process for them. So here's my first one. Now, in the last sentence, since this is inverted, I have to have an answer to the essential question. So let's see how I get there. The few years we are granted to walk these halls during our formative years are meant to help cement the type of person we wish to become as adults. So starting with the context and background. Yet, as we know, the teen years are a time of angst and rebellion to push the envelope and see how much we can get away with. But there is a fine line between being a typical defiant teen and a downright criminal. So 3 sentences of context and background. The definition is being presented there. And now the thesis comes last sentence. With regards to recent TikTok trends, the desire for a mere like simply proves that you are a soulless person without worth or value. So here's what I'm telling my students. In the thesis statement, there's essentially one word that you need, and it's like in air quotes, because that's coming right from the essential question. So I want to see air quotes and the word like. And that's what you're going to do to get anchored in that thesis. And that's a very easy kind of rule for students, a goalpost for them to do. You know, have like and put some air quotes around it, because that's what the question is ultimately asking. So if you see in this, you know, there's a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary without overdoing it. It's not overkill. The sentence constructs are very varied. There's good rhythm and flow. But you may notice, oh my goodness, Christian, you have second person in there. Why would you do such a thing? I'm a huge proponent of this. So I think for students to get rhythm, flow, and voice, it's very hard to do that talking in the third person. So I have them use second person often. Even my AP kids, the College Board has no definitive stance on this, and I've seen in the anchor papers that they present, the calibrated papers, that a lot of students are starting to use the second person, and it's a really nice way to get voice. But here's the thing. I like a teeter-totter balance between colloquial, vernacular, and academic. So this one has that here. So the kid sounds spunky. They have flair. They sound like a hipster, right? So that's what we ultimately want them to do. Here's another one following the exact same template. So we're going to end with the thesis, air quote likes, 3 sentences, context, background. The boomers are always writing on teens about something. Generation after generation, the older folk are always complaining about something and deriding teens for blazing their own paths. Little do they forget, their parents and grandparents were objecting to their teen behavior just as they are doing to ours. It's not about a trend, and it's not about likes. It's about kids being kids and our desire just to express ourselves without adult ridicule and scorn. So as you can see here with my exemplars and models, I'm showing a wide range of theses so that I'm not pigeonhole students into a particular thesis statement. I want to show a wide spectrum so that they can come up with their own thesis without regurgitating something that I say. So this follows the exact same kind of prescription formula that the first did. It's housed in 4 sentences. Tier 2 sentence constructs end with the thesis, air quote likes in the end. Here's another one done the exact same way. Let the kids be kids. Those that are raising the biggest stink about these trends forget that they were once the subject of scrutiny from the older generation for their hippie hair and protest music. Every generation has their thing. It's not that teens today are doing anything for a stupid click of the like button. It's just an expression of our protest and anger at the way things are. Different theses, different spins on the essential question, all following the exact same template of the inverted thesis. So this is doing nothing different stylistically in terms of the approach. The execution is the same every single time, no matter what direction the thesis is going to go. And here's one last one. The actions of a few unfortunately come to speak for an all-encompassing labeling for an entire generation. No, not all teens are so self-engrossed as to do anything for a mere like. There's a small handful of kids desperate enough to think that a devious lick or a slap to a teacher's face is something to elevate their status into the big leagues of being the biggest goat on earth. For some, a like is worth their entire sense of self-decency. For others, that very same like is nothing they'd ever even contemplate desiring. Look at the voice in this. So if I were doing a writing workshop with my students, I would say, hey guys, I just said goat in an introduction. What do you think about that? And they'd probably snicker. And I'm like, yes, yes, do it. Like, let's drop some vernacular. Let's drop some colloquialisms in here because you have great vocabulary in the other areas. Engrossed, encompassing, right, are good words. Mirror, self-decency, contemplate. So the other vocabulary, the tier 2, again, is not over the top. It doesn't sound pretentious. It doesn't sound out of my wheelhouse. But teeter-totter balancing that colloquial with the academic is a great way to get voice. But you can see also that at times there's some slipping into the second person, which I'm completely fine with. So I lied. Here's the last one. While our parents were slam dancing to grunge music and wearing flannel, their parents were on the sidelines passing judgment and disapproval. Every generation has a certain kind of brand and flavor that tries to buck the system. Whether it be greaseback hair or nose piercings, each decade has their particular thing. Us going for likes is the thing of the 2020s, and there's nothing wrong with that. So again, each one follows the inverted model, 3 sentences of context and background to set the foundation for the thesis, which answers the essential question in the last sentence. So as you can see here, all 5 have the air quote likes in it. And I think that's a good way for students to focus on absolutely guaranteeing themselves that they've articulated a clear thesis. In the last sentence. So this really readily sets the student up to establish a line of reasoning in the body paragraphs if they hold true to their argument and keep it focused and keep it cogent. So let's talk about the body paragraphs. Introductions are done. How do I construct the body paragraphs? Well, if you're familiar with my work, I always say bust out the syllogistic method. And if it's new to you, I'll walk you through it from the start in a broad sense. So the syllogistic method comes from Aristotle. So well before the era of Jesus, Aristotle ran a high school, a school called the Lyceum. And the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn polemics, oration, debate, math, and science. And they would often have these wranglings where they would throw out a question like, what is justice? Which is the main essential question in Plato's Republic. And they would go on and on and on and on for days, weeks sometimes, just chewing on that question. And each philosophical figurehead would throw out a definition of what justice is, and each definition would have to be within a syllogistic form. It's very mathematic, it's very computative, very much like 1 + 2 = 3. So here's an example of a simple syllogism. So in syllogisms, you go premise, premise, conclusion. It's very mathematic. So if I say in premise 1, arsenic is deadly, in premise 2, my dog ate arsenic, I could conclude my dog is going to die. So that's a very simple syllogism. If I were to say, first premise, any 38-year-old or older non-felon born in the U.S. can run for the presidency. Second premise, James is 42, non-felon, born in the state of Rhode Island. Conclusion, guess what? James can run for the presidency. So you have to be very, very cogent. And one of the buzzwords in composition, buzz phrases, is line of reasoning. And this template really helps students to establish that line of reason very well. I often use the word cogency when you're just locked in logically. You're very disciplined in how you logically proceed through an argument. So in argument and synthesis, this is what the syllogistic method looks like when we define the parts. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So up top in the thesis, you just drop the answer to the essential question. In the first premise, you have to answer the question, why? And I tell my students to take 3 sentences to do that because I want their argument to be central. I don't want them getting into the source materials too soon because then they get waylaid and it becomes plot heavy and regurgitative in the sense that they're just spitting back theses that they read in the articles. So if they take 3 sentences, they're guaranteeing themselves that their argument is central. But it has to be a why reason. So 3 sentences for that. The second premise is going to be textual support. So they have those articles. Ultimately, they have to synthesize 3 for this one. It's just an early synthesis essay early in the academic year. Ultimately, I'll bump that up to College Board standards. So that's a teeter-totter balance between quoting, paraphrasing, getting directly into the text, talking around the text, blend that together. The conclusions work like this. Ultimately, the first premise is a promise. So you got to link it back to the first premise, but you also want to echo the thesis. So you have to readdress the essential question in the conclusion. So here's the other kicker for this. A syllogistic body paragraph is going to be a minimum of 10 sentences. So I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, don't exceed 12. Otherwise, you're just going to prattle on and probably get waylaid and break your line of reasoning and get super plot heavy within the articles and the supplementary material. So let's look at this. I've highlighted the syllogism for you. First premise, why reason. We're going to take 3 sentences to set this up. So there's going to be no mention of the articles at all. My argument's going to be central. The cross-generational comparisons are false. Equating our parents' long protest hair and ear piercings to what is unquestionably criminal behavior is foolish and illogical. What kids are doing today simply crosses a line and is worthy of jail time. Clear why reason there, right? You're arguing. So synthesis is argument. So the argument is central there and is very manifest, it's very clear. So now, to keep the line of reasoning, all the quotes and all the paraphrasing needs to be linked to that first premise because the first premise is a promise. So in the 4th sentence, I tell my students, immediately get into the sources. Start talking about your textual support. And that's where this goes. Take, for example, the case of Jameer Collins in Little Rock, Arkansas. Dared by the 9 friends at his lunch table, he accepted the slap a teacher challenge just to earn a few likes and brutally attacked his 66-year-old math teacher. All right, so you can't go on and on and on about Jameer Collins. Now let's link it to something. We're synthesizing here that the articles, the textual support is going to be in conversation with each other. So we got Jameer. Let's dive further into that by piggybacking some of our source material. So we're going to this guy called Gary Heath. Gary Heath, a reporter for MSN, states that Jameer's attack left his teacher blind in one eye and forever traumatized. But there's an interesting take on this. First, one needs to ask themselves how something so ugly as this has become a trend. Now let's move on to our next source. Megan Vince cites a phenomenon known as Lemmings Theory as one explanation. In essence, this theory suggests that today's teens are so willing to gain approval that they will toss themselves off a suicide cliff just to gain the respect of their peers. So let's talk about what's going on here. We have 3 sources. They're all talking to each other beneath the umbrella concept of the first premise. Nothing extraneous is coming in here. It's a 1-2 punch of quote, paraphrase, link it all to the line of reasoning here. So we quoted, and let's talk about that. It's a silky smooth quote transition. It sounds very conversational, and I have a trick for that. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student takes a minimum of 5 words, and keeps the quote small, the quote transition should be smooth. It should sound conversational. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words, and then the quote is small, and there's no abrupt transition. So it works pretty much every time. So we quoted about Lemmings Theory. Now we got to unpack it, keep it connected to the first premise. Lemmings are literally an animal that collectively commits suicide together without even ever considering the consequences. This is analogous to what teens today are doing when they accept these Tik Tok challenges. Jason Kuiper, the superintendent of schools in a Chicago suburb, attests that these trends cost his district over $20,000 in damages when they can already barely afford basic supplies. All right, so I got a lot of textual support in there. It's all linked. In the conclusion, let's echo the thesis. We have to tie it back to the essential question. So here's a little trick that students can do. The thesis has air quote likes. So how about the conclusion of the syllogism have air quote like to fully link it back? So that was just a little gimmick we had for this essay. So the conclusion only takes a couple of sentences. No generation before us has was willfully violent or destructive. So you're getting back to the first premise, right? That's the argument that was present in the first premise. Sure, there were protests, but what is the greater cause of destroying school property and assaulting innocent teachers? The truth of the matter is this: what some teens are willing to do for a like is sickening. And that took 12 sentences. So that's a complete syllogism, and you can see a very clear line of reasoning in there from start to finish. That's very cogent, very well argued, very much sticks to task, and is dutiful. It's just kind of hammers home the argument with sufficient support and analysis and wraps it all up in the end. So very syllogistic in its nature. So students say, I'm done with my first body paragraph. How do I write the next one? And we say, the syllogistic method, it works every time. Just switch it up, switch your why focus, and you don't want to be redundant, so give another why reason. Choose new quotes, new things to paraphrase, maybe even go into different articles and weave it all together so that your argument stays central. So I'm going back to a different thesis statement here just to show the students how to argue the other side of things. But I'm going to use the exact same template. Take 3 sentences to articulate that why reason. While the folks from the 60s will be forever remembered for being hippies, and the 70s disco, and the 80s bad hair, and the 90s grunge, we will be remembered for our Tik Tok trends. And there is nothing wrong with this. What would be a greater sin is if we left no trace of our decade whatsoever. So again, clearly articulated argument there. It's definitely a why reason, 3 sentences. 4th sentence, get into your sources. So we're going to go to this guy, Matt Tower. Let's hear what this says. Matt Tower hits the nail on the head when he says that this generation of kids have a justifiable reason for their angst and rebellion. So again, we had the 5-word rule, and I needed to use brackets here to keep it conversational. So students need to learn how to bracket so that their quote transitions are silky smooth. He goes on to say that teens today are processing the effects of a global pandemic, the restriction of their rights, and the looking upon their futures that seem rather bleak. All right, so I don't want to go on and on and on about Matt Tower. So just a couple of sentences. We got to remember I'm limited to 12 sentences. I don't want to exceed that. So let's keep the argument central, but weave in some other source material here. This generation has it tough because our world is falling apart right before our eyes. While previous generations could live the American dream, Mary Caters reminds us that today's teens can anticipate living the American nightmare blighted by an endless pandemic, a poor economy, poor schools, and dismal job opportunities. So again, there I have the 5-word rule, and I'm blending this teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. So that all needs to be tied to the line of reasoning, though. I have not deviated from the first premise. It all falls underneath that umbrella concept. So quote, analyze. Teens have every right to be angry because the older generation let us down. The fact of the matter is that we do not have our lives handed to us on a silver platter like they did. So by comparison, trashing a bathroom pales in comparison to the real-life difficulties we are facing. Oftentimes, the voices of teens are not heard and are dismissed as kid talk. Vince Nixon, a sociologist of 4 decades, suggests that a devious lick and slap a teacher is nothing more and nothing less than a primal scream loudly proclaiming, "We have had enough. Do something now to help save our future." All right, that's plenty of support and analysis. Very good. The source material is in conversation with each other. They're talking to each other. The argument stayed central. The first premise, we did not deviate from that. So in the end, tie it back to the thesis. Let's make sure there's an air quote like, and it just takes a couple of sentences. Our generation is extreme because these are extreme times. No generation before us has faced anything like this. What we need are more likes because we've had enough. Such a strong argument, such a cogent argument, very disciplined, very dutiful, very diligent from start to finish. And it's syllogistic in nature, right? So you have to go, arsenic is deadly. My dog ate arsenic. My dog is going to die. We need kids to be that deliberate in their line of reasoning. And this template helps yield that and afford them the opportunity to be that logical and lockstep in their analysis, in their arguments. So now I hope you can go on your way and become a veritable Bob Ross of composition. So you can hopefully use this writing workshop in your class. My students loved it, from the Socratic seminar to the essay, even the revision process. They had a great time with it. So if you want the actual PowerPoint that I'm using for this presentation, email me and I'll be happy to send it to you, and I'll also send the articles as well. So my articles were kind of broad and vague because I didn't want to front load or spoon feed a thesis to the student. So if you want different articles, by all means do that. It's also a good idea for students to find their own sources, which a lot of my students did. They said my material was insufficient for the direction they wanted to go. So thanks for checking it out. And if you're intrigued, know that I do offer some courses and some consulting. So I am going to begin a brand new class called the Teach It Right Symposium. That's the web page there, the link to the web page if you want more information. But in a nutshell, here's what's happening. So I'm not sure if you have heard that Tim Freitas of Garden of English fame and fortune and myself are writing a textbook together, and I'm in the research phase of my writing. And in exchange for about a 45-minute to an hour-long debriefing session after the symposium, I'm offering the symposium for half off for your time. So basically what I'm going to look for is, how well are you doing implementing my templates in your classroom over a 5-week period? And how well are your students doing with that? And it's just going to be anecdotal information. I will not use your students writing in the textbook. That just becomes a logistical nightmare, getting parent permission and district permission and all of that stuff. So just anecdotal debriefing session of 45 minutes to an hour, and the symposium will be half off. So hopefully you enjoyed this and you can use it in your classroom. For now, be well, happy teaching, and happy writing.